Welcome to New Paradigm Podcast. Now, I was originally not planning on covering this topic first. I had a few other things in the works, and then a couple of recent events coincided and caused me to reconsider and bump this up to the top of my priority list. The first of which being that I had just recently listened to the collision between Sam Harris and Hannibal Buress on a podcast. And for those who haven't heard that yet, it actually really wasn't all that significant. It was Sam Harris on a podcast with a few other people. They're having kind of a group discussion, and they got around to the topic of policing in America, and then, of course, by extension of that, policing and the black community. And what came of that discussion was just an hour-long breakdown in communication that really ultimately went nowhere and accomplished very little. But I still found it fascinating in how representative it was of most of our conversations on race and most of our national dialogue on race. And in some sense, I guess it actually was a little bit significant because of how, just despite how unproductive it really was, this was about as thorough and rigorous of a conversation as we can really have right now on the subject of race. And that's a problem because it was ultimately not sufficient. And so that's really what caused me to want to come in and just lay down a few of my own thoughts, because I know Sam Harris has taken it upon himself to start commenting on this issue, and he is trying to kind of promote a little just more realistic and deep conversation on this topic about race and society and race relations and policing. And he's bringing in a lot more data that's really not discussed whenever this is brought up on a radio program or one of the 24-hour news networks or a podcast. That is, he's talking a lot more about statistics and population numbers and crime rates and policing procedures, what can be expected of police, and then some things like just the actual science of combat and the science of fighting. So again, all of this is great, and he's covering a lot of ground that very few other people are. But that being said, there are still some major dampers on his arguments, and it can only go so far, and we'll never really get to the conversation that we need to have by taking his approach. And his approach is to work from within the Overton window, within the accepted Overton window on this subject. And that Overton window, that's just the spectrum of what's considered to be acceptable discourse. And when we're talking about race, that's a major problem, because that window is, at least in the United States and in most of the West, that Overton window is extremely narrow, and it is very, very far to the left. And that's what caused me to want to take up this issue as my first podcast. I'm just going to be laying out a very, very basic framework for a few very consequential points that are always absent when we have these discussions. And I think when I'm done making my case, it should be pretty clear that these points need to enter our national conversation on race. And it is going to be difficult getting to that point, because at this point in time, whenever we hear these dialogues about race, we hear it on a radio show or on a television show or anywhere in the media, it's never actually a dialogue. Now, with a dialogue, you imagine an exchange of ideas and an actual debate with conflict, with opposing views. But whenever we hear this discussion in the media, there are very few opposing views. It's always a monologue. One side of the argument is usually given carte blanche to lay out their entire case and complain as long and as loudly as they want. And then the opposing side, if there even is one, is more or less just kind of expected to be persuaded by the other side. Now, the mainstream Overton window on this topic dictates that all arguments must begin from the premise that every human group, every human population, every human race is completely identical. And Sam Harris, whenever he discusses this topic or brings it up on a podcast, he's always arguing from within these confines that all human groups are completely identical. And lately, he's even kind of taken up sort of a new mantra affirming this point, where he says something to the effect of, if you're identifying as anything more specific than a Homo sapiens at this point, I don't know what you're talking about, or you're wrong, or something something to that effect. And so for that reason, yeah, I think Sam Harris fits very comfortably in the camp of genetic egalitarians, which is unfortunate for him because he's so brilliant. You think that he would know better than that. Now, these genetic egalitarians, they either think that human differences don't exist, they think that differences do not exist across groups, or they think that differences may exist, but the differences that exist are so small and so inconsequential that it's as if they don't exist. And I do understand where this comes from, and I do understand how people can fall for this, and if you really don't think about it too deeply, it does sound as if it makes sense. It does sound good. Okay, all right, so we've got that explained. Let's move on to the next topic. But hold on a second. When you actually say this aloud and think about it for a minute, it doesn't take long to realize just how silly it all sounds. So, when you treat differences between groups as if they're totally meaningless, you're treating it as if these differences across groups are something that really is pretty inconsequential, like height, maybe. So you say, well, okay, 65% of males in our society are 6 foot tall. Well, okay, well that means that 65% of males in prison should be 6 foot tall. 65% of males arrested should be 6 foot tall, and so on and so on. And by that logic, it is completely logical that these people get upset when they see disparities in things like arrest rates, prisoner rates, things like that, because they literally transfer this logic into the real world. And when you do that, all you have to do is just pull up something like a census, and you can forecast how many, what demographics all the prisoners should be from and everything. Okay, well, our city has 30% of the people in our city are from X demographic. Therefore, 30% of our prisoners should be from X demographic. 30% of our people arrested should be from that same demographic. 30% of people shot by the police. And clearly this is all insane because it disregards the actual real-world differences that exist across groups. And those differences are not inconsequential. There are differences in traits that actually matter, that actually influence human behavior. For example, our national dialogue on race is often focused on things like the disproportionate number of black prisoners, the disproportionate number of black arrests, the number of black people who are ticketed, and so on and so on. Now, I'm going to go into just one physiological difference that can affect this type of thing, which is just absent. And this is one of many differences that have been established, and it's completely absent from our national discussion on race. So it's well established that levels of testosterone vary across groups. The highest average levels in the United States have been found in black American populations, followed next by white Europeans, and then below them are East Asians. Now, levels of testosterone, they vary for all sorts of reasons, but these baseline differences are well accepted. For example, one study found that even after controlling for all other variables, black American males still had on average 15% more testosterone than white American males. And then it can also be assumed from there that they had even more than 15% testosterone than Asian American males. Testosterone is often associated with violence and aggression. Now, this is typically true, however, there are factors within the body that can mitigate some of this. One mitigating factor is the stress hormone called cortisol. Cortisol levels fluctuate for many reasons, just like testosterone does. However, like testosterone, it's been discovered that the average levels of cortisol do vary by race. One recent test has found that black American males generally had lower levels of cortisol throughout the day than the other two groups who were tested, who were white American males and Latino American males. This means that on average, African American males have a higher average level of testosterone and a lower average level of cortisol. Now, I'm going to read a small excerpt from a recent study on aggression in males, aggression and testosterone in males. In a pilot study of salivary testosterone and cortisol interrelationships, it was found that higher testosterone levels and lower cortisol levels are associated with higher levels of anger. Motivational drives are mediated by punishment and reward and expressed by approach and avoidance tendencies. Sensitivity to punishment is reduced when testosterone levels increase, and this means that less fear is manifested in aggressive behavior, whereas the high cortisol levels released in stressful situations increase punishment sensitivity and avoidance, resulting in the choice of flight behavior. Therefore, when a high testosterone-cortisol ratio occurs, it is more likely to result in socially aggressive behavior. Okay, so as we can see, just based off of these two differences, just as testosterone and cortisol differences that do exist across groups, just based off of these differences and nothing else, we can expect that various populations will have different rates of violent crime, they will have different arrest rates, and so forth. And I know this is objectionable to many people, but kicking and screaming and denying it doesn't change this reality. And to deny these differences and act like they're inconsequential will, again, it won't change the science of it. It won't change the existence. If anything, all it will do is keep the public in a state of confusion and resentment. And I know some people might come in and try to argue that, well, testosterone levels, they vary based on all kinds of activities, and we found that it can go down if you get married or if you have a child. Your overall baseline testosterone may go down permanently, and maybe we can do this, maybe we can do that. Sure, yeah, there may be ways to decrease this level of testosterone, but the fact is that for now, for whatever the reason is, these average differences in testosterone levels and cortisol levels exist. And regardless of what's causing these differences, the fact that the differences are there dictates that it's extremely likely that that'll play in and that'll be a factor in higher crime rates, higher levels of violence, higher levels of all kinds of violent behavior. Moving on. Now, another factor disrupting race relations is human tribalism. Now, when I talk about tribalism, I don't mean this in the sense that Sam Harris does. Lately, when Sam Harris talks about tribalism, he talks about it as if it's some sort of a pathology. It's, an abnormal development of culture. And again, I'm reminded of his mantra, if you're identifying as anything other than a Homo sapiens. Now, when he says this mantra, it is a kind of a cute sentiment, and I'm sure it's a nice one-liner to have on hand if you're someone like Sam who goes on a lot of talk shows and you kind of need an immediate applause line in your back pocket. You can whip that out at just the right moment. It's great for that, but for practical purposes, it's just an absurdity in how far removed it is from human life. Now, I'm not going to go too deeply into this subject, as it is something that I have plans to explore in depth in the future, but I am just going to lay out a few of my basic thoughts on what effect this is having on our national dialogue on race. Okay, so most people are well aware that humans have tribal tendencies. Now, there are studies that suggest that people have subconscious bias towards those who resemble their own race, and there's even evidence that people actually find it difficult to remember the faces of people from other races. Now, there's obviously a lot of incentive to investigate this and find out if it's the result of culture and socialization or if it's genetic, and if it is cultural, well, it can probably easily be corrected in some way if we just change the environment. So, scientists have set out to answer that very question, and I've got one result pulled up here that I think will really surprise most listeners. So, there was a recent test of infants' reactions to faces of people from different races, and the researchers wanted to find out if some of this kind of innate tribalism, if this stuff really is innate or if it's just cultural and young children won't exhibit any of these traits because they haven't picked up the culture yet. Well, they found that infants as young as 3 months old already exhibited a preference to gaze longer at faces of people from their own race than other races. At 3 months old. And I think at 3 months old, it's pretty difficult to argue the case that these infants have already been socialized into some kind of a tribal society. They're already picking up on society's institutional racism in one way or another. I mean, this is some pretty solid evidence from very early innate tribal tendencies within humans. Now, how is this relevant? Well, I think that a lot of people will agree with me that there's some kind of an innate tendency for people to have a negative reaction to transgressions against their own group or their own tribe by an outside tribe. Now, within the U.S. and within the West, the police force is largely viewed as an extension of the majority white society. And for that reason alone, I think we can anticipate some degree of resistance to policing and police in general just based on demographic differences. We can see some of this demographic allegiance in action each time one of these interracial stories hits the media. For example, polling has shown that there are often stark racial splits in public perception to the verdicts of some of these interracial cases. This goes back to things like the O.J. Simpson verdict, to the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman verdict, to a little more recent things like the grand jury decision to not bring charges against Officer Darren Wilson. And there was a very interesting Pew poll on that very subject where they had asked black and white respondents their opinion on the grand jury decision. And they found that 80% of black respondents said that the grand jury decision to not bring charges against Darren Wilson was the wrong decision. 80%. And now that's significant because this poll was done after 2 autopsies confirmed Darren Wilson's account of events, and a 3rd federal autopsy, which admittedly these people didn't have access to yet, but the 3rd federal autopsy was just days away, and that would be coming out to confirm the results of the first 2. And I think this is as clear of an example of this kind of tribalism as you're going to find, where regardless of the evidence, the autopsies, the witness accounts, regardless of all of that, you have people just lining up along ethnic lines in a conflict, basing their opinions on nothing else other than just the demographics of the 2 people involved in the conflict. And this phenomenon is repeated over and over and over whenever any of these interracial stories hits the media. And right now when we see these protests and these riots on television, I think many people tend to think that there's this degree of outrage and violence, it must be correlated with some equal degree of injustice. But this isn't necessarily so. Again, just because of people's innate tribal tendencies, we can expect that there will almost always be a certain amount of knee-jerk reaction to interracial policing, especially when it requires the use of force or deadly force. And it should be just understood that outrage in and of itself is not always indicative of an injustice. And this is such an important point, because when people don't take this into consideration, I think a lot of people look at these riots from the outside and think that this violence, this intensity, it must be correlated with an equal degree of oppression and injustice. Otherwise, why else would people be acting like this? And because of this misconception, people tend to lend a false legitimacy to these riots. They look at them as if there's something justified, almost like a slave revolt, when in reality they're much closer to ethnic warfare. Finally, I want to move on to the most controversial area that I'm going to be talking about, and that is the average differences in IQ across groups. Now, 100 years of IQ testing has shown that the average white American IQ is around 100, and the average black American IQ is around 85. Now, I understand that this is going to provoke a lot of people, but this is another difference that's hugely consequential, and we can't afford to just ignore it and pretend as if it doesn't exist. Now, IQ tests generally measure abstract reasoning abilities, and I know there are people who will want to challenge this and claim that the tests are biased and the tests aren't true and the tests don't mean anything anyway. There's a very popular misconception that IQ tests are somehow a knowledge test. That is, you go sit down to take your IQ test and they ask you a whole bunch of culturally biased questions such as, who was the 21st Vice President of the United States of America? And of course, only the people who are the biggest history buffs with the best education and went to the best schools, had the best tutors, only they would know the answers to this. And so, of course, it comes out biased in the favor of other groups. well, this is not true, and this is not at all what IQ tests are like. And in a way, I don't really blame people for having this misconception, because IQ tests aren't commonly administered to the average person. To anyone who finds this idea repugnant or provocative, all I can do is urge you to go out and get an IQ test, and you'll see that this is not true, and that there'll be no way that you can walk away from that test thinking that what you just did was culturally biased. And you'll see that the majority of what these tests involve are things like pattern recognition, information grouping, information splitting, tests of vocabulary, tests of geometric shape manipulation, tests of memory capacity, testing your ability to manipulate and change information in your mind. And none of this is cultural at all. Now, this topic of abstract reasoning, things like that, this topic actually sort of indirectly came up in the podcast between Sam Harris and Hannibal Buress, where at one point someone started talking about how people are just so much more easily swayed by anecdotal YouTube videos that they see, these videos of police shooting suspects or police shooting unarmed suspects. And they're just so much more swayed by seeing 2 videos on YouTube than they are by thoroughly done statistical data that shows, well, this actually, for as tragic as those 2 cases may have been, this is not actually a national trend. And why is that? Why are they more swayed by the 2 videos than by the statistics? Well, that's because statistics are an abstract representation of something that doesn't actually exist in front of your face. And unfortunately, it's going to be fairly difficult for a person with an IQ anywhere around 85 or even lower to fully grasp and make a mock-up in their head of what all of these statistics mean. And they're especially not going to be persuaded by statistics when those statistics are challenged by 3, 4, 5 YouTube videos that seem to show something that really riles emotions in that person. They're just not going to be persuaded that those videos are not indicative of some kind of a trend. And this came up in that podcast between Sam Harris and Hannibal Buress, where at one point, Sam Harris, he started talking a little bit about crime statistics and population statistics, and Buress was having none of it. He had no interest in the statistics, and his response was to just dismiss them as saying, oh, well, I guess that's okay if you want to take kind of a smarty pants approach to it. And you could tell that was starting to really get under Sam's skin, because for as patient and as accommodating as he was trying to be to Hannibal Buress, you could tell that just bothered him. And he told Buress that statistics are the only way we have to actually gauge what's happening in the world. They're the only way we can tell if something is increasing in frequency, if something is decreasing, if something's happening more to one demographic of people than another. It's the only way we'll ever know. We can't figure that out just based on people telling their anecdotes and looking at a couple videos on YouTube. We don't know what the actual trends are. And Hannibal Buress just had no interest in entertaining that at all. And that response is exactly what you would expect from someone with an IQ of 70, 80, 90, maybe even all the way up to 100. They're just not going to have the ability or interest to sit down and parse through all kinds of abstract information that to them has no relation or bearing on what they just saw with their own eyes, which was a video of someone being shot by police or whatever the situation was. And this is going to be a real communication problem between groups, is that whenever one of these controversial videos emerges on YouTube, there are large swaths of the population that are already going to be riled up just because of tribal reasons, and then to think that you're going to bring them to the table and sit down and have this big, rigorous, in-depth discussion about all of the nuances of the situation, and you're going to explain the statistical trends, that actually this thing that you've been told is a real national crisis and how you're being hunted. Actually, the statistics don't bear any of that out. That type of a dialogue is just not going to be productive with people who are hovering around an 85 IQ, which is the reality in America right now. And for whatever you think about IQ testing, if you think, oh, well, maybe we could improve that in the future, maybe it could get better, maybe we could do this, maybe we could do that. Again, just like with the testosterone differences, the differences in IQ, for whatever the cause, they are there right now. They exist. And that's going to be a huge barrier to having any kind of effective interracial dialogue. How do you explain the nuances of some of these situations to a population whose mean IQ is 85, a number that within the general overall population is almost kind of a borderline dysfunctional range, to where you'd expect some kind of difficulties with work and society and life. Really, how, and especially when the demographic who has this IQ is also inflamed by maybe whatever the latest controversial video was, and so now they're already inflamed just based on ethnic identity alone, and then factor in the ability to handle abstract reasoning, things like that. Now, how do you bring this population to the table for a rational sit-down discussion to talk about all of the nuances and all the statistics that explain what they just saw? And what's even more disturbing about all of this is this recent trend of man bites dog journalism in the media over the past few years, where we've seen just an absolute frenzy to get a hold of any and every story in which a black male was harmed by a police officer or just by a white person in general. And this has real-world consequences because they're whipping up all of this tribal allegiance and this tribal resentment, and they're selling this stuff to a demographic who, large portions of this demographic just don't have the built-in mechanisms to put all of this stuff in perspective. And it doesn't matter if they bring out retractions months down the road and they admit, well, we actually had 50% of the story wrong, and as it turns out, it's not really the tragedy that we originally played it up to be. At that point, it doesn't matter. When the buildings are burning, when the neighborhood is being looted, when people are being pulled from cars, and people are being beaten by mobs in the name of justice for whoever the victim of the week is, at that point it's too late. And it's extremely reckless for the media to be whipping up this kind of hysteria the way they do. So those are just a few of my ideas of what's missing from this national dialogue on race. And really, whenever we hear this topic talked about in the mainstream, really what we're talking about is race relations. We're talking about relations between groups. We're talking about the politics between groups. We're talking about disparities between groups. But we're never actually talking about race itself. And that's really the underlying thesis of what I'm arguing here, is that a part of our national dialogue on race needs to be the reality of race itself. It's not part of the conversation yet, but it's going to have to be. Now, in this podcast, I've gone over just a few of the many, many differences that exist across groups that factor into all kinds of disparities in behavior, achievement, just everything, all aspects of human life. There are all sorts of underlying factors that contribute to this, and this is just going to have to become part of our mainstream conversation. Listen to just the few differences that I have addressed in this podcast. I mean, these differences have been empirically shown to exist. And so that being said, how can we actually have a discussion about these topics without talking about any of these genetic factors that play into it? And I know one challenge that people are immediately going to throw at me that I want to address right now is they're going to say something to the effect that, well, we have a lot of cases in which we found that the police have actually unjustifiably murdered someone, and so that's what's actually sparking a lot of this. Well, first of all, I'm going to say right off the bat that in cases of undeniable murder, yes, and that everyone's on the same page in that case. I've never heard a single person actually justifying or defending cases of true unjustifiable murder. Now, that being said, a lot of these stories that are originally being pitched to the public as murder are then later turning out to be something other than. But yeah, and again, to repeat, in these cases where it's been unquestionable murder and it's been examined in a court of law, we're all on the same page in that sense. But, let's even take the whole topic of policing and violence and riots. Let's set that whole topic aside and just take a moment to look at some of the other areas of life where all these racial disparities emerge, and we're told we need to have this national dialogue on race. Let's look at health. There are huge racial disparities in things like lifestyle diseases such as diabetes, HIV, syphilis, chlamydia, gonorrhea. Now, it's again, it's pretty difficult to make the case that police oppression and bad police and oppressive society, it's tough to make the case that that's causing HIV or that's causing syphilis. It's pretty well within your control to prevent getting HIV. And, well, what are some of the factors that can stand in your way of that? Well, for one, something like a low IQ can impede your ability to plan for the future, to assess risks, to take precaution, everything. And should that be a part of our national dialogue on health disparities? I think so. It's at least absolutely must be a factor at play in these disparities. And let's move on to disparities within the school systems. We're constantly told about how disciplinary rates aren't equal across demographic groups, suspension rates aren't equal, black boys are being suspended at 20 times the rate of white students or Asian students. Well, when you're looking at this through the mainstream Overton window, in which all children in that school are completely interchangeable human beings, of course it doesn't make sense. On average, all of the white children are behaving completely identical to all of the Asian children, who are, on average, behaving completely identical to the black children. And so when that's your frame of reference, of course none of this makes any sense. Of course it doesn't add up. How is it that all of these children who are identical, sans skin color, how is it that one group could have so many more suspensions than everybody else? How could they really be committing that many more behavioral infractions? That doesn't seem very likely. On the other hand, when you consider the average baseline differences in testosterone and cortisol that I laid out in this podcast, maybe that is having an effect on behavior in the classroom. Maybe this higher testosterone and lower average cortisol is causing these children to, on average, commit more behavioral infractions and therefore get suspended more frequently than other groups who have lower testosterone on average. Maybe all of this stuff is relevant and should be a part of our national dialogue on race. And now I know people want to resist this. I know that there's just a natural inclination to fight all of these pieces of information every step of the way. But just stop for a second and ask yourself why. Ask yourself, how are we really going to benefit as a society from lying, denying, and obfuscating? What is that truly going to achieve? And you have to understand that once these differences are empirically shown to exist, that they're real, they're part of the real world, and they are just there, they just exist. And that's all completely irrespective of your emotional state and your emotional reaction to their existence. Lying, denying, and throwing a tantrum and putting your fingers in your ears and saying you're not going to accept it and let's keep looking for a different explanation. None of this actually makes those differences disappear. And again, I want to stress that I do understand just how objectionable and just how radical all of this comes across. And that's largely in part because of how far outside the mainstream it is, which comes back to what I was saying about the Overton window on this topic. And that's going to be a real challenge moving forward for us, is that we have to find a way to widen this window and move it far enough to the right that it can incorporate scientific knowledge and scientific findings, which already exists. It's already out there. The challenge will be moving ourselves and moving our society to the point where we can accept this information and we can come to peace with it. And conversations like this one and the conversations that are being had on similar podcasts all throughout the internet, these are going to play an important role in moving society through this transition phase to the point where we can actually accept this information. And a lot of people are going to put up a lot of resistance along the way, but ultimately we will get there, and we'll all be better off for it in the end. And I think that despite people's greatest fears, they will come to realize the fact that the logical conclusion of group differences is not death camps. In closing, I ask that you take a serious look back at the points raised in this podcast and ask yourself, can you honestly argue that we'd be better off pretending as if none of these differences existed? To those of you who do want to have an honest dialogue about race, can that even happen if we're going to omit so much information from our discussion? Can we solve a problem if we're openly opposed to fully understanding it? For at least a half a century, we here in the West have imposed a silence on ourselves, barring each other from ever discussing these ideas, and cherry-picking science that supports a view of the world as we wish it was. I think that most people will agree that this method is not working. I don't claim to have all of the answers to these questions, but I do know that for a solution to have any chance of working, it's going to have to take into consideration all of the variables at play, and it will have to be built on an accurate model of reality.